Hi, I'm Teresa Martin from Lower Cape TV, and your host for The Minds of Summer, produced in partnership with the Cape Cod Institute, which brings leading thinkers and doers from around the world to its renowned workshops right here on the Outer Cape. In 2011, Flint Sparks launched his TEDx talk by observing that the challenge is not how to change the world, but how to meet a world that never stops changing. So I'm delighted to have with me today Flint Sparks, because this is a challenge that each of us grapples with each and every single day. You're both a Zen priest and a clinical psychologist with over 35 years of practice as a psychotherapist. You've been a leader in the holistic cancer care movement, and you also founded the Austin Zen Center. And today you're the resident teacher at Appamada, I have that right? Appamada, which is a contemporary center for Zen inquiry. So I have to say, I don't think I've ever met a Zen priest before.
Oh, well, so, there's always the first time.
There is. And, you know, it's funny, popular culture uses Zen, you know, as kind of a throwaway term, like, oh, that's so Zen. You know, so what is Zen? And for that matter, what's Appamada? I mean, it's a loaded question, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot in it. Zen, of course, the word has been commodified, just like so many other things that have historical roots, deep meaning, some profound sense of service, like mindfulness. Is another one.
Yeah.
It technically represents a stream of Buddhism that moved from northern India into China, mixed with the Taoist tradition, and became Chan in China and ultimately Zen in Korea and Japan. So from a comparative religion point of view, that's its root.
Very ancient, really, really ancient roots.
Yeah, several thousand years old.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not what people think about when they say, oh, that's so Zen.
Right.
They're usually pointing to a sense of poise and equanimity and clarity, maybe even beauty in the Zen arts. So they're pointing to things that have touched them, that have been transmitted through some sort of art or literature or something, and that's really not Zen. What is Zen is the way that they were touched, what turned inside in response to those things. There's a kind of a humorous but profound quote from Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, who was the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, which is one of the largest Buddhist organizations in the Western world. It was where I did most of my training and the temple out of which I was ordained. Someone asked him one time, what is Zen? He said, Zen is when any religion goes beyond itself, including Zen.
Okay, your mind goes, woo!
Yeah, it's something larger.
Yeah.
It's something larger than belief. It's something about experience, which takes it back to its Taoist roots. The nature of our experience in the world as human beings, not transcendent beyond this world, but in it. And that's the world that keeps changing, and in our contemporary culture, more and more rapidly. So that's our challenge, as you said.
It's how do you be in it?
Yeah.
Well, it seems that that way of looking at the world is incredibly relevant to how we live and how we survive today. And that, to me, is, well, let me ask you, you're a psychotherapist too, so how do you connect the dots between those two things?
You know, the dots began to connect for me, personally, because of some of the work I had done. I worked for a number of years with people who were suffering and struggling with advanced cancers. My specialty was in the field of behavioral medicine. And the struggles that they brought to me were, of course, their medical struggles, but also their psychological struggles as they faced end of life, pain, loss in their family, things like that. But they were asking me questions that weren't just psychological, they went further. They were maybe questions of the soul or the spirit, and I wanted to be able to respond to those things.
Well, it seems when you're facing something, an issue like cancer, either in yourself or in your family, it's hard to not ask those questions.
That's right. They come naturally, and what the patients and their family members taught me was that there was a need to address those questions that weren't explicitly religious always, but were very personal and very intimate. And so I began to search about ways I could learn to respond better.
Right.
And since I had been trained psychologically in medical hypnosis and biofeedback and visualization, things like that, I wanted to understand spiritual approaches that had to do with the use of the mind for healing.
Right.
And so I looked to Eastern traditions, and I was very naive. And when I began to study Buddhism—
very Zen, right?
Yeah.
You were.
Don't know, mind, beginner's mind. I found that Buddhism was based out of the Buddhist teachings, and he had only one question: how do we deal with suffering? Well, I was in the suffering business, basically. I was dealing with deep suffering. So I began to study the teachings, then engage the practices, which is a whole different thing, for myself. And I realized that there was this way in which one could do psychological work, which was extremely helpful, very, very beneficial. But it's easy to get caught in endless loops of self-identification and self-referencing, sort of endless self-help.
Right.
And it's hard to step away from it. Then I began to spend years in temples and monasteries training, and I found that people were excellent meditators. They understood the Buddhist teachings, they could express it, but sometimes in sitting in meditation, things would arise psychologically in that silence and stillness, and they didn't know what to do with what arose. But you put these two things together, the psychological work, which helps us literally grow up into our full maturity, and the spiritual practices, which help us wake up to who and what we actually are beyond just our personality. And those two things together provided a rich and nuanced and very durable kind of a practice base for what I was experiencing personally and what I was teaching and meeting and the people I was working with.
Well, I know that's one of the phrases you use is grow up and wake up.
Yeah, and that they go together. I use that double helix model because it indicates they're two parts of one thing. And the bridges that hold those two streams together are practices. For example, the contemporary expression of mindfulness practices, which come from ancient traditions, but are used quite a bit now. And that's one of the bridges. Mindful practices assist us in understanding how spirituality affects our psychological growth, and how working with psychological difficulties and letting them soften opens us to our sort of larger spiritual nature. They help each other.
Well, this is very interesting we're talking about this because we live in a society where talking about spirituality or religion is almost taboo. Either you're wacky or you're, have some other hidden agenda that you're using religion for, and it becomes very polarizing. Is this stuff, how is this important to us, and why do you think we're in this place where, if we talk about spirituality, you kind of get the look?
Well, there's a couple of ways to think about it. One is, as you look around the world, you see how much pain and suffering is actually caused by religion.
Yeah.
And that's a very large topic, which is beyond what we're talking about today. But one piece of that has to do with the danger of rigid belief. And what Zen or Buddhism does is offer us a way to begin to open. Suzuki said, in the mind of the beginner there are many possibilities. In the mind of the expert there are few. So it's this beginner's mind. If we cannot get locked down into belief, because as soon as we believe this instead of that, we make a line.
Right.
And we make a line, you're on one side of it and I'm on the other.
By definition, it's always going to be people.
Yeah, instead of that opening.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons that I think there's such a difficulty. Then if someone doesn't believe what I believe, or if I believe something different than you, if we're caught in belief, and it seems it's salvic somehow, it's going to save us in some way by believing this, then if you challenge it, then I can become fearful.
Right.
And if I become fearful, I can become not so pleasant. It doesn't often look like contraction. Sometimes it looks like aggression. So this is how fear gets turned into aggression, because we get challenged in a way we're not quite sure how to respond. And the teachings that I'm offering, I hope, allow us to have a possibility of like opening through non-solidification into a belief rather than contracting around a belief, actually opening to possibilities.
So that seems that ties back very much to your growing up kind of comment, because part of growing up and part of the psychological side is, at least how I've always understood it, is to not react to what you might feel or see around a belief that might or might not be true. So you get angry about the candy going away instead of understanding, oh yeah, the candy's all gone now.
That's right. Accepting things as they are.
Yeah.
But it has a lot to do with what you might call ordinarily, doesn't sound very spiritual, the process of maturity. In our less mature ways of personal development, we end up being self-centered.
Yeah.
And more mature people, as you know, are quite generous. And so that difference makes a big difference. The capacity to experience gratitude for your life instead of complaining because it's not like you want it.
Right.
A generosity instead of what can I get. And a sense of humility instead of egotistic kind of entitlement. All of those things shift one's perspective on the world tremendously so that you can meet it with great tenderness and intimacy and care rather than what are you going to do for me and what's wrong with this world because it doesn't fit my expectations.
My expectations. I mean, that's a big.
But our whole culture is based on that, really.
Yeah.
And so this is a countercultural approach, really, in a lot of ways. Both the idea of how to step beyond just being an adult, but step into this larger space of generosity and gratitude, and how to do that in a way that doesn't require the solidification into a belief which sets me in opposition to others.
And that sounds
open
very
our hearts.
difficult, though. I mean, it's very easy for people to hear an argument and come to line up behind that argument.
That's why it's popular. It's easier.
Yeah.
It's what I'm talking about is not quite so popular because it's harder.
Yeah.
It's what we're designed for, actually. And it's what we're called to. It's just not always available in a way or with a direction or a teacher that can help you see what's possible. And that's what I hope we can have a bit more of, and why I teach in the way I do. You know, I'm traditionally trained and was ordained in a very traditional school of Zen, but I offer it this way.
Right.
I have a little hair, not long, and but not with robes and much ritual.
Yeah.
Those things are powerful in their own way and can be deepening, especially as a training. But I want to make sure there aren't counter-cultural things in the way to invite as many people as possible to understand what it's like to have a possibility of this more open heart, open mind, and intimate kind of care in the world.
So that's interesting because there's, you know, mindfulness is, again, another of these buzzwords right now. When you listen to the dialogue around it, it sometimes feels like it's a reaction to, I don't like technology, I don't like the 21st century, I don't like, you know, this whole list of things. And I hear you saying, well, I'm kind of embracing the 21st century with this very ancient tradition. So that's kind of interesting.
Well, pushing against is going to once again set up a line.
Yeah.
Now, it's true that a tweet isn't a little whisper in your ear, an email isn't a kiss on your cheek, an invitation to be a friend on Facebook isn't a warm outstretched hand.
Right.
They aren't those things, but they are something. But if you push against them, you're going to defeat something that's actually quite useful, if you understand how to use them. Now that's the key. What's an appropriate response? What's a mature use of what we have now? So that we can actually use these things to connect us, even if they aren't as personal as individual touch. So this is the world we live in, and every teacher in every age has had to use what they had. So the question is, how do I wake up and how do I grow up in this body at this time with these people under these circumstances? These are the ingredients. It's like going in the refrigerator and opening and seeing, how can I make a meal from this and make one that's nourishing?
I think of other places where technology has changed the way we do things. And I come out of print, and so of course, the many inventions of the printing press in Korea, in Sumatra, in Germany, all the at different points in time, has always caused this kind of angst and backlash that somehow we're losing things, and there have always been counter forces to that. But you're saying, instead of getting in a line behind a force or a counter force, you simply look at it and figure out, how do I incorporate it in this way that I want to be?
And one of the founders of the school that I trained in the 13th century said, in response to a question, what is the mind of enlightenment? He said, intimacy with all things. How do we meet each thing as it is?
Right.
A few centuries later, another Zen master was asked the same question, and he said, the mind of awakening is an appropriate response. So we have these two things. How can I meet life as it is and then respond appropriately? I'm going to be lined up in an accord with life, not fighting it. And this is the life we meet now. So this is the life it's important for me to know what to do with.
Right.
This is where practice is on the ground, right here, now.
Instead of trying to make it something it isn't.
Right, and mindfulness, as you said, is a tool that is extremely ancient in a lot of contemplative traditions. It's taken from, I think, in Buddhism specifically these days, because it's expressed in a way that's quite useful. The problem is that extracted from the larger teachings and the larger context in which those teachings would take place, it is a useful tool, but it becomes quite limited. Then it's as if we're only teaching people to relax. That's helpful.
Right.
Be more focused and concentrated. That's really useful. There are many things it's useful for. That's not the problem. The problem is that if mindfulness were being taught in the old days, it would be understood that the person receiving those teachings would have a teacher, would be in a culture where it was understood, and what it opened a person to. So it's not that the techniques are a problem, they're wonderful and quite useful, and there's more to them. And then people begin to use them like, oh, mindfulness is like, be a better tennis player, or just like Zen. And yes, it is useful, and it's smaller than what it really means. But for some people it's an entree, and that's useful. At least it brings them to begin to question things they may not have questioned otherwise. And if they do that, that's helpful.
We have another phrase that I've heard you use, spiritual friendship, and sometimes you counter that with the technical, sort of medical, clinical approach to being in the world.
Sure.
How does that fit into what we're talking about?
Yeah. Well, you know, we forget, I think, in the midst of both our highly technical medical and psychological research, and even in our spiritual life, these two sides we're speaking about, we forget that we're animals. We're mammals.
Right.
And as such, we're the kind of mammals that require each other. Even a baby, a child's brain, and hence their personality, their use of language, everything, doesn't come online all by itself. It requires another. We create each other, and we continue to create each other throughout our entire lives. The new research on neuroplasticity, all of that suggests that we influence each other quite powerfully. Now that's a contemporary expression that there's a lot of research for.
Right. You use the word empirical a lot.
In the old days, when the Buddha was teaching about this, he was talking to his cousin Ananda in one of the early scriptures, and he was talking about spiritual friendship. And Ananda wasn't understanding. He said, you got to meditate, you know, all this.
Right.
Finally, the Buddha's teaching, he helped him understand a bit more. And finally, Ananda said, I get it. This is way more than I thought. Spiritual friendship is at least half of the whole path, you know? And the Buddha said, no, it's the whole thing.
Wow.
Later in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha was talking to the audience, and he said, I've taught in a linear fashion where you can understand, well, then we're just like we do.
Right.
Moral action, here's meditation. He said, but now I'm going to tell you the truth. This whole thing is way bigger than I've told you. In fact, it's beyond any person's comprehension. And then there's a famous line, only a Buddha and a Buddha can understand it. Only through deep, ineffable meeting can we actually understand what our lives are and their meaning. And it happens between, not in.
It's that magic space that,
ultimately, taken out of all that context, it's as if we just walk together hand in hand along the path. And since I work with so many people who are ill and dying, you begin to get a very clear, not theoretical, sense of how, in a way, we're all walking each other home to the inevitable.
That just gives me chills thinking about that. I mean, I get a very powerful image, and it's just, you know, this interconnectedness.
Which is the primary realization of the Buddha. When he sat under that tree, he realized only one thing, as much as the teachings are elaborated. The original word, paticca samuppada, dependent origination. Everything comes about as a result of its interaction with everything else. There's no way we can separate out any one thing. Even you and me, we're all influencing each other. Everything is contingent. And then number two, and everything's impermanent. So it's this big flow. Everything is changing and everything is influencing each other. That's very different than our idea of me, you, this, that.
And it's very different from kind of our current cultural construct, which wants to be able to put everything in a box with a name and be able to move it and see clear cause and effect.
That's right.
And explain everything in a repeatable
That's right.
way.
And that clear linear cause and effect is useful for very small things, but it's not very useful in understanding the mystery of being alive. That it's going to take you to a larger, even beyond systems, to understand this immense flow that we're in and how there's an ever-changing flow, and that we can flow with it. In fact, there's a word in the Buddhist teachings where he talks about right view and right action and right livelihoods. People have heard about these things. The word that's translated as right into English, marga, doesn't mean right as opposed to wrong. It's not like you have the right attitude or the right word. It's a word that suggests everything flowing together, like at the center of a river where it's not split off or in eddies, that you're flowing with. So this is a way of learning to be in accord with life, instead of fighting life, or separating it out, or trying to, the worst, trying to get it to go your way. Only.
Only your way.
Of course we do our best, but, but ultimately we have to surrender to how it goes.
Well, you have 3 words that you said, and I'm just going to quote them again, right? You're going to know what I'm going to say. Pause, reflect, connect. And that seems to be very central to what you've been teaching and working with.
Yeah, when I was putting together the TED Talk, as a matter of fact, I'd worked long and hard, as you might imagine, to be on that stage. And this is a secret, so I'll tell you in public here. At 2:30 in the morning, I wake up, needing my sleep, of course, before I'm going to present. And I knew there was something missing, and I didn't know what it was, and those 3 words came to me. How can I most clearly say, in the simplest terms, what I'm trying to convey? That if we don't pause in this fast-paced world, we're always going to be a slave to time. And if we don't learn to reflect, we're always going to be at the reaction of everything around us. And if we don't connect, we're always going to feel alone and fearful.
No spiritual friends.
Yes. So if we can pause, reflect, and connect, that's actually enough for a lifetime of practice, really, as it opens up.
And yet it seems, 3 simple words, but the depth of that, when you stop and reflect on it, is immense.
If you stay with them, and stay with them as questions instead of imperatives, what does it mean to pause? What does it mean to reflect? What does it mean to... In fact, here at the Cape Cod Summer Institute, the first day, the first thing I spoke about as we did our first meditation practice, I said, here is my instruction, and it's a question. As you close your eyes and settle in mindfulness, how simple are you willing to let this be? It's so easy to make things complicated, but the elegance of trying to help things be simple enough and then let it open from there. I asked my teacher once a question that was about these very things that you're asking right now, and he said, wow, that is such a good question, it would be a shame to answer it.
So I guess I can't ask you to answer it because I'm like, I want the answers. Come on.
Well, because all he was saying was, if you have a good question, which is way more important than answers, then it just keeps opening. It's durable. It lasts. It continues to feed you and nourish you. But if you try to put it to rest, boom, done, then it's over.
And that's what we want to do. I mean, we live in a...
If we don't want to be afraid. You see, almost everything that you're speaking about contemporary culture is because we're terrified of facing the way life really is. And that's one of the reasons we need each other. If I'm going to face this difficulty, I use the metaphor sometimes, I want to really look into the Grand Canyon because it's magnificent. I mean, it's the great wonder of the world. And I want to go up to the rim of that canyon and look over. But what I want to do, the only way I can do that is I want you to hold on to me really tightly so I can look over. Otherwise, I'm too scared. Well, it's like that in spiritual life. Because I need someone who will hang on to me as I look in places that we're afraid to look. But we inevitably have to. And if you do it right at the end of your life, it doesn't go well. And the people that I worked with who were at the end of their life, and as I watched them drop their body, they would often say towards the end of their life, and this is not news, you see this everywhere, they really were only concerned with one thing at the end. Did I love well or was I loved?
People really do come around to that.
Really, that's all that's left over, because your body is going, your mind is going, everything you've created in the world is leaving. That's really what people are left with. So when people ask me now, you've been a therapist, you're a Zen teacher, what do you really do? And I say, I think my job is to remove barriers to love, because in the end, that's all that matters.
Wow.
And that's what I think this work is about.
Removing those barriers.
To being able to really love, to be able to stop long enough to see each other, to reflect with each other long enough to actually be heard and to feel the other person's presence. And in that process, connect deeply beyond just the social
Well, how can we do that? I mean, you work to help people learn how to do it, but is it within each person's own ability to be able to do that? That's
how we're built. That's the beautiful reality of being social mammals. It is what we want. And it's what wants to come forward if we are given the right circumstances and the right conditions. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't necessarily have the best family life, or we have conflicting messages about what it means to be ourselves. That's why psychotherapists have jobs, to handle those things. But spiritual teachers, we get exactly the same questions and exactly the same challenges. When a student comes to me as a priest, they tell me exactly the same things that a psychotherapy client would tell me.
Wow.
The difference isn't what they bring. The difference is who they meet and what we're going to take a look at and how we're going to meet it. And both are useful.
Right.
To work out the struggles and to give us a sense of who we are beyond our struggles that's always with us. There's an ancient text that starts with a little story. And in that story, someone comes to the Buddha and says, and the word Gautama is used. It says, the inner tangle and the outer tangle. This generation is entangled in a tangle. Tell me, Gautama, who succeeds in untangling the tangle? That's 2,500 years ago. This generation is entangled in a tangle. If they only knew.
I know.
So the inner tangle and the outer tangle, the psychological, the relational, the spiritual, this generation is entangled. Who succeeds? And that's your question. Who succeeds? The one who practices. The one who begins to see reality as it is. Who through clear meeting with a good friend, someone who cares, we begin to turn not just this way, but toward life as it is.
That's actually a beautiful image to end with, because believe it or not, we are out of time. I'm Teresa Martin from Lower Cape TV, and with me today has been Flint Sparks, who is, and I'm going to say this word again, the resident teacher at Appamada Contemporary Zen Center. Appamada. Love that word.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for your time.